Since we know social skills programming is so important and critical in a good ABA program, let's talk about some readiness indicators. Now, these indicators are not necessities, but they are just areas where if your student is showing these skills, social skills programming is probably perfect for them. The first is the ability for the student to follow basic instructions. We call this instructional control. So if you're going to work with social skills training, meaning you'll have other students around your student, you want to make sure that your student can actually respond to instructions, at least some minimal instructions. Sit down, give me 5, look over here. Second, eye contact. Now this eye contact may be with just an adult initially, but you do want the student to be able to look at another when they're speaking. The third item is low levels of inappropriate behavior. This could be low levels of aggression or low levels of self-stimulatory behavior. You want the student to be able to manage their behavior if they're going to be interacting with other peers. There are multiple reasons for this, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the module.
In this module, we're going to talk about behavior management, and we'll mostly do so within the context of behavior reduction. We'll talk about behaviors that kids with autism often exhibit and how to reduce those inappropriate behaviors. But it's important to point out that everything we do is behavior. That includes the positive behaviors as well. So when we talk about behavior management, that doesn't just mean inappropriate behavior. My language, my communication with other people, initiating interactions with peers, my compliance, my sitting down, participating, responding, attending, these are all behaviors, and we want to think about them as behaviors. But within the context of this module, we'll talk mostly about behavior reduction. Skill acquisition, increasing positive behavior, we'll talk about in other video modules.
So typical learning environments will look something like this. The teacher will sit on one side of the table and the student would sit on the other side. This is how classrooms are usually set up. Now, this is a great learning environment if you have a student that's comfortable and stays at the table. For an early learner, you're in an awkward position here though, because it gives them the opportunity to dart away from the table, and that can be a problem. If you're in an environment where there are lots of other distractions or reinforcers, you need to make sure that the child is staying at the table. So the problem with being across from a student is I'm left with not very many options if they decide to dart. So if you're going to start therapy in this kind of environment, you probably want to move your chair around. So let's look at some different positionings you might choose to use. The data sheet you see in front of you is called an all trials data sheet, meaning that all the trials you conduct with a student in a discrete trial session would be recorded here. So let's take a look at this data sheet. What you'll see at the top of the sheet is a section for the instructor or teacher's name. Next, you'll see a space for the location of the session. This becomes important if some of the sessions are done in a school environment and some are done at home. You'll also see a section for recording the time of the session. This becomes important because remember, you may have more than one session in a day, so there may be a morning session and an afternoon session, and you may want to compare the child's progress or performance across those 2 times of the day. Lastly, you'll see an area for the date of the session. Below this general information are the specific programs and targets that you're working on with the student. There's a common misconception that discrete trial teaching must occur one-on-one across a table in a sterile environment. While this sometimes is the case, it isn't always necessary. These teaching trials can occur anywhere. At the table, certainly, but in the car, in the living room, on a swing. What is important here are the teaching strategies that you're using, and that you as the instructor are selecting what to teach and offering reinforcement when the child does what you've asked them to do. Since we know reinforcement is so critical in any learning, the next step is determining what might function as a reinforcer for your student or your child. There are several ways to do this, the most formal of which is a preference assessment. In a preference assessment, the instructor, teacher, or parent would put two options in front of the child. They could be any two things that you might think the child would be interested in. You then watch which of those items the child approaches. Do they go to the book or do they go to the Cheeto? You would then record which of those items was approached most often by the child. From that, you basically get a top 10 list of what items your child might find reinforcing. In this video clip, you'll see Kelly working with Parker. She conducts a mini preference assessment, offering up 2 items to Parker to see which one he chooses. She does this several times, thus getting an idea of what might function as the most powerful reinforcer during the session. So far, you can see the ball is the most powerful reinforcer, but she's about to offer up another one. So from this mini preference assessment, Kelly has determined that the ball and chip are probably the 2 most powerful reinforcers for Parker during this session.
Let's talk about what each prompt would look like separately. The most intrusive prompt that I could use for a motor behavior would be a full physical prompt, also known as hand over hand. In this case, I would prompt the student to do exactly what I want him or her to do with no independence. A touch prompt would be a partial physical prompt. I would do part of the behavior for the student, but he or she would do part of it him or herself. If I touch the student and he or she does some portion of the task independently, it's a touch prompt. This is indicative of a student performing some of the task independently. Even just a small piece, if there's any independence, it's a touch prompt rather than a full physical prompt. So with regard to the flexibility, even if a kid with autism has the interest and the language abilities to have conversations, he or she may not have the ability to maintain them over time. So many of our conversations begin with a handful of scripts. There are just a few ways in which we begin conversations. Where are you from? Where do you live? What do you do? After that, they go in any number of different directions, and you or I need to be flexible with regard to what direction those go in. Children with autism have a problem with the flexibility of maintaining the conversation. So the further we get from those initial scripts, the more difficult it's going to be for a kid with autism.